A deal forged in desperation. The rain streaked down the panoramic glass of the penthouse, turning the London skyline into a watery blur of light and shadow. Julian Thorne stood before it, a silhouette against the storm, his hands clenched behind his back. At 36, he had built a global security empire from the ground up, his name synonymous with impenetrable strength. But tonight he felt utterly powerless. The words of his father's solicitor echoed in the vast, sterile room, a final act of control from beyond the grave. "The terms are absolute, Mr. Thorne. To assume full control of the company and the family trust, you must be wed by your next birthday. 30 days. Remain a bachelor, and your voting shares revert to the board." The old man had never believed Julian's work ethic could replace a proper legacy, a wife, an heir. It was a final, cruel joke. His phone lit up with a constant stream of alerts. Congratulations from socialites, offers from acquaintances, a torrent of opportunism since the clause had been leaked. He silenced it with a grimace. Every one of them wanted the billionaire. None of them wanted the man. A soft sound from the hallway broke his reverie. The gentle swipe of a cloth, the quiet click of a door closing. The night cleaner. Alara. He barely knew her name. Just another efficient ghost who kept his world pristine and invisible. 3 floors below. In the staff quarters, Alara Vance pressed her phone to her ear, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Please, Dr. Evans, there must be another way. A payment plan, something—" Her voice was a tight whisper, choked with a fear she couldn't afford to show. On the other end, the doctor's tone was apologetic but firm. "The treatment for your sister's condition is time-sensitive, Ms. Vance. Without the deposit, we cannot hold the slot. I'm truly sorry." The number he mentioned made her knees weak. It was more than she could earn in 5 years of scrubbing floors and polishing silver. The call ended and she sank onto a stiff chair in the laundry room, hot tears of despair tracing paths down her cheeks. Her sister, Isabel, her only family, was slipping away and she was powerless to stop it. She didn't hear the door open. She didn't hear his approach over the hum of the industrial dryer. It was only when his shadow fell over her that she started, scrambling to her feet and wiping her face hastily with her sleeve. "Mr. Thorne! I'm so sorry, I'll get back to work immediately." He didn't speak at first, his sharp, intelligent eyes taking in her red-rimmed eyes, the tremble in her hands. "My office," he said finally, his voice not unkind but devoid of its usual impatience. "Now." In the intimidating expanse of his office, surrounded by shelves of awards and degrees, she felt smaller than ever. He gestured to a leather chair, but she remained standing, her work-roughened hands twisting together. "I couldn't help but overhear," he began, bypassing any pleasantries. "Your sister. How much do you need?" The question was so blunt, so utterly unexpected, that she could only stare. "Sir, the total cost, the treatment, the aftercare, everything. What is the number?" A cold dread joined her panic. Was he offering help only to fire her for her personal distractions? I couldn't possibly—" "It's not your concern, Mr. Thorne. It won't affect my work, I promise." "It is my concern," he stated, moving to his desk and pulling out a sleek folder. "Because I am prepared to solve your problem, all of it. In exchange, you will solve mine." He explained the terms of the will, his voice a cool, clinical recitation of facts. When he finished, the only sound was the quiet tick of a vintage clock on the mantelpiece. "You want me to marry you?" The words felt foreign on her tongue, a ridiculous fantasy from a cheap novel. "For 6 months. A business arrangement. You will receive £200,000 now for your sister's care. Upon the successful completion of our contract, another $300,000. You will live here. Play the part of my wife in public and in private. We will lead completely separate lives." Her mind raced, a whirlwind of practicality and terror. It was insane. It was degrading. It was also the only miracle on offer. "And my sister? She will receive the best care money can buy. She can recuperate here, in a private suite. Your only duty, beyond the public appearances, is to ensure no one discovers the true nature of our arrangement." Ilara looked at this man, this fortress of a human being, and saw not a savior, but a lifeline thrown from a ship she never thought would notice her drowning. She thought of Isabel's smile, her courage through the pain. What was her pride against that? "I have conditions," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of the strength she used to protect her sister. "Name them. Isabel comes first. Always. If she needs me, I am there regardless of your schedule or our facade." Agreed. "And when this is over, we go our separate ways. No strings, no complications." A shadow. Something almost like disappointment flickered in his steely gaze for a nanosecond before it was gone. "No complications," he echoed. That night in her small rented room, she stared at the contract. The numbers on the page were astronomical, a fortune to save a life. Her phone buzzed. An unknown number. A text. "Ilara, this is Julian Thorne. Regardless of your decision, I have instructed my accountant to settle your sister's hospital deposit. Some things cannot wait." She read the words again and again, tears welling once more, but this time they were tears of stunned relief. He had given her sister a chance with no guarantee of return. She picked up the pen. Its weight felt like a universe. As she signed her name, she sent a silent plea into the void. She had just made a deal with a man who traded in absolutes. She could only hope her heart wouldn't become part of the bargain. The move to the upper floors of Julian's London penthouse felt like crossing into a different dimension. The guest suite assigned to Ilara and her sister was a study in minimalist luxury. All soft gray tones, plush carpets, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a dizzying view of the Thames. It was larger than their entire apartment had been, and so sterile it felt more like a museum exhibit than a home. Isabel, though still pale and weak from her first round of treatment, had gasped in delight at the room prepared for her, complete with a window seat piled with books and a gigantic stuffed dog. "Is this really for me?" she'd whispered, her eyes wide with a wonder that made Ilara's heart ache. "For as long as we're here," Ilara had replied, her voice tight with the unspoken truth of their temporary residency. The household staff, who had once been her colleagues, now treated her with a stiff, formal deference that was more isolating than any ignorance. Mrs. Albright, the head housekeeper and a woman whose spine was as rigid as her pressed uniform, had greeted her with a tight-lipped, "Good morning." Mrs. Thorne, her tone implying 1,000 unspoken criticisms. The title felt like a costume that didn't fit. Julian was true to his word. He provided everything, yet gave nothing of himself. Their lives were meticulously separate. He left for his offices before she rose, and his dinners were taken at his club or in his study. The first test of their facade came swiftly. A society columnist had gotten wind of the elusive Julian Thorne's sudden marriage and demanded an exclusive. A photographer and interviewer were scheduled for a casual at-home feature. A team of stylists arrived, transforming Ilara from a woman who knew the weight of a scrub brush into a mannequin worthy of Julian's world. They draped her in a cream-colored silk blouse and tailored trousers that felt alien against her skin. Her hair was smoothed, her makeup applied to highlight features she'd always considered plain. When she looked in the mirror, she saw a convincing imitation of a society wife, but her eyes still held the anxiety of an imposter. Julian arrived home precisely on time for the interview. When he saw her, he stopped short, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. Surprise, perhaps, or maybe just appraisal. "You look appropriate," he said, the compliment feeling more like a quality assessment. The interview was a performance. Julian played his part flawlessly, his arm resting lightly around her waist, his smiles timed to perfection. He spoke of a whirlwind romance, of being captivated by her refracing authenticity. Ilara smiled, nodded, and let her hand rest on his arm, feeling the solid muscle beneath the fine wool of his suit. It was the first time they had truly touched, and the contact sent an unexpected jolt through her, a warmth that was entirely at odds with their cold arrangement. When the interviewer asked how they met, Julian smoothly lied, "Through a mutual friend who insisted we simply had to meet. I suppose they were right." He squeezed her hand, and for a terrifying moment, the gesture felt real. After the crew left, the silence in the room was heavy. The facade dropped from Julian's face instantly, leaving the familiar impassive mask. "You did adequately," he stated, already moving toward his study, but the cracks were already forming. Ilara noticed things. The way he worked through the night, the empty coffee cups she'd find outside his study door in the morning. One evening, drawn by the low light spilling into the hallway, she found him asleep at his desk, his head pillowed on a stack of contracts, exhaustion etching lines on his face that his daytime confidence erased. Without thinking, she fetched a blanket from the linen closet and draped it over his shoulders. He stirred, murmuring a sleepy, "Thank you, Mother," before sinking back into sleep. The vulnerability in that moment shocked her. In turn, Julian began to notice her, not as his employee or his contract wife, but as Ilara. He'd hear her soft, melodic voice singing Welsh lullabies to Isabel at night, the sound drifting through the vast, silent apartment. He found himself pausing outside her door, just listening. He observed how she helped the new kitchen assistant with his reading, how she always remembered the name of the junior porter's son. One afternoon, he came home unexpectedly early and found her not in her suite, but in the main kitchen, laughing with the cook as she attempted to make Isabel's favorite soup, a simple, hearty recipe from their childhood. She was flushed, a smudge of flour on her cheek, and she looked more vibrant, more real than she ever had in silk and cream. "Mr. Thorne," the cook exclaimed, suddenly formal. Ilara turned, her laughter dying on her lips, her hands stilling in the dough. "Julian, I didn't expect you home." He stood in the doorway, taking in the scene. The warmth, the mess, the genuine happiness on her face. The penthouse suddenly felt less like a perfectly designed box and more like a place someone could actually live. "Neither did I," he said. And for the first time, his voice wasn't cold. It was simply quiet. "Don't stop on my account." He didn't join them, but he didn't retreat to his study either. He simply watched for a moment longer before turning away, leaving Ilara with a confusing flutter in her chest and the distinct feeling that the walls of their gilded cage had just become a little less solid. The invitation was thick, cream-colored cardstock embossed with the insignia of the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra. It was their first major public event as a couple, a black-tie gala where the city's elite would be watching, dissecting, and judging Julian Thorne's mysterious new wife. The air in the penthouse grew thick with a new kind of tension, one of practiced smiles and choreographed movements. Another team of stylists descended, this time with a gown of midnight blue velvet that seemed to drink the light. It was elegant, sophisticated, and felt like a suit of armor. As Ilara stared at her reflection, the woman in the mirror was a stranger, a beautiful doll ready for display. Julian, when he saw her, simply gave a curt nod of approval. "Remember the talking points?" he said, his tone all business. "We met through a mutual friend. We prefer a quiet life. The charity work is our shared passion." The gala was a whirlwind of crystal, champagne, and calculated charm. Ilara held on to Julian's arm, her hand resting lightly on the black wool of his tuxedo, a fixed smile on her face as he introduced her to a dizzying parade of lords, CEOs, and celebrities. She felt their eyes on her, heard the whispered questions behind gloved hands. Who is she, really? Where did he find her? Then, a voice cut through the polite hum, sharp and sweet as poisoned honey. "Julian, darling, and this must be the little wife we've all been hearing so much about." A woman glided toward them, a vision in silver silk that seemed poured onto her willowy frame. Victoria Sterling. Ilara had done her homework. Old money, Julian's former fiancée, and a woman whose smile didn't reach her cold. Assessing eyes. "Victoria." Julian's voice was carefully neutral, but his arm tensed under Ilara's hand. "We were all simply stunned when we heard the news," Victoria purred, her gaze sweeping over Ilara with dismissive efficiency. Julian always said he'd never be caught dead walking down the aisle. "And yet here he is with you. It's so modern. Tell me, my dear, what was it you said you did? Before all this?" The question was a well-aimed dart designed to humiliate. The circle around them fell silent, eager for the spectacle. Julian opened his mouth to interject, to spin another practiced lie, but Ilara spoke first. Her voice was softer than Victoria's, but it carried a quiet steadiness that cut through the tension. "I managed a number of complex logistical operations for a demanding private client," Ilara said, her smile never wavering. She met Victoria's gaze directly. "Scheduling, inventory management, restoration of high-value assets." It taught me the importance of attention to detail and discretion." She let the pause hang in the air, a subtle counter to Victoria's blatant nosiness. "Though I must say, organizing a gala of this scale puts my old responsibilities to shame. The coordination must be immense. Your work on the committee is quite impressive. It was a perfect parry." She had answered without truly answering, elevated herself without arrogance, and complimented her attacker, all while revealing nothing. A few people in the circle chuckled appreciatively. Victoria's smile tightened into a brittle line. Julian looked down at her, and for the first time that evening, his expression was utterly, genuinely surprised. The look in his eyes was not one of appraisal, but of dawning respect. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Julian stayed closer, his hand occasionally finding the small of her back, a gesture that now felt less like a prop and more like a genuine connection. They danced once, a formal waltz, and his grip on her hand was firm, sure. "You were remarkable back there," he murmured, his voice low against her ear, sending a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Later, returning to the penthouse, the silence was different. The performance was over, but the energy between them still hummed. He helped her with the clasp of her necklace, his fingers brushing against the bare skin of her neck. The contact was electric. She turned to face him, the vast dark living room illuminated only by the city lights below. "Thank you," she said softly, for not letting her eviscerate me." "You didn't need my help," he replied, his voice rough. "You were magnificent all on your own." He was standing so close she could smell the faint scent of his cologne, see the flecks of silver in his blue eyes. The careful distance they had maintained for weeks evaporated in that charged silence. His gaze dropped to her lips. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, hopeful rhythm. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. The kiss was not part of any contract. It was tentative at first, a question. Then, as her hands came up to rest on his chest, feeling the solid beat of his heart beneath her palms, it deepened into something else entirely, something hungry, passionate, and terrifyingly real. It was a kiss that spoke of late-night conversations, of shared looks across a room, of a connection that had been growing in the cracks of their agreement. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. The shock of what they had done hung in the air between them. The lines were no longer blurred. They were obliterated. Julian took a step back, his expression a storm of conflict and desire. "Ilara, he began. But words failed him. She simply stood there, her lips still tingling, her world tilted off its axis. The facade had not just cracked. It had shattered, and lying amidst the pieces was something raw, real, and utterly terrifying. The rules were gone. Now they were navigating uncharted territory, and neither of them had a map. The charged silence from the night of the gala settled over the penthouse like a thick fog. Julian retreated, becoming more distant than ever, burying himself in work as if he could outrun the memory of that kiss. Ilara, meanwhile, felt unmoored. Every glance, every accidental brush of hands as they passed in the hallway, was now loaded with a meaning that threatened to drown her. She needed to understand the man behind the billionaire, behind the contract, behind the kiss that had felt more real than anything in her life. Driven by this desperate curiosity, she found herself outside the one place in the penthouse that felt uniquely his private study. The door was usually locked, but today it stood slightly ajar. Pushing it open felt like crossing a final boundary. The room was neat, dominated by a large desk of dark wood. It smelled of old paper, leather, and him. Her eyes fell on a simple, weathered metal box sitting on a shelf behind the desk. It was out of place among the expensive trinkets. Something compelled her to open it. Inside, nestled beside a faded photograph of a young Julian with a severe-looking woman, his mother, she presumed, was a thick, legal-sized envelope. It was labeled simply, Thornman Holdings, Succession. Her heart began to pound, a sickening rhythm of dread. This was it. The original will. With trembling fingers, she broke the wax seal and pulled out the documents. She read the words once, then again, her mind refusing to process them. It wasn't just about losing voting shares. The terms were catastrophic, designed for utter ruin. Should Julian Edward Thorne fail to meet the stipulated condition of marriage, all controlling interests, assets held within the Thorneman Trust, including the primary residence, shall be immediately forfeit and dispersed to the remaining board members. The room tilted. He hadn't just been protecting his company, he had been fighting to avoid total destitution. The cold, clinical businessman had been a man backed into a corner, facing the complete annihilation of everything he had built. And he had chosen her not just for her invisibility but for her desperation. He had seen her vulnerability and had used it as a key to his own salvation, manipulating them both into a cage of his own design. The study door clicked shut. She whirled around, the damning papers clutched in her hand. Julian stood there, his face pale, his expression one of sheer, unadulterated panic. He looked, for the first time since she'd known him, like a boy caught in a terrible act. "Ilara, I can explain," he began, his voice stripped of all its usual authority. "Explain what?" she interrupted, her own voice shaking with a fury born of betrayal. She thrust the papers toward him. "Explain that this was never about shares? That it was about losing everything? Explain that you didn't just need a wife, you needed a hostage? Someone so desperate she wouldn't ask questions? It's not that simple." He tried to step toward her, but she backed away as if he were poison. "It seems very simple. You researched my life. You found the one thing that would guarantee my compliance, and you bought me. You didn't just manipulate the situation, Julian, you engineered it. Was any of it real? Or was even that kiss just part of the performance to keep your investment compliant?" The words hung in the air, brutal and sharp. The mask of the billionaire tycoon completely shattered, leaving raw anguish in its place. "No," he said, the word ripped from him. "God, no. The kiss. That was the one real thing in all of this mess." "How can I believe that?" she cried, tears finally spilling over. "You built this entire prison on a foundation of lies. You let me think this was a business deal between equals when you were just using my sister's illness to save your own skin. I was saving us both." He shot back, his own composure breaking. "Yes, I found out about Isabel. I was going to pay for her treatment anyway, anonymously. But then the will was read and the clock was ticking, and I was staring into an abyss." He ran a hand through his hair, his breathing ragged. "I'm brilliant with contracts and mergers, but I am a coward when it comes to you. I had no idea how to talk to you, how to tell you I'd been watching you for months, that I was captivated." The admission stunned her into silence. He sank into the chair behind his desk, looking utterly defeated. "I fell in love with the way you hummed when you thought no one was listening," he said, his voice a low, tortured whisper. "I fell in love with the patience you showed that clumsy new porter. I fell in love with the strength you carried yourself with, even when you were clearly exhausted and scared. I saw you at the hospital with Isabel reading to her, and you were the most beautiful thing I had ever seen." He looked up at her, his eyes blazing with a desperate honesty. "So yes, I took the coward's way out. I created a transaction because it was the only language I was fluent in. Because the idea of telling you the truth, of being vulnerable and facing your rejection, was more terrifying than any business loss. Because I knew that a woman like you would never willingly choose a man like me." Ilara stood frozen, the legal papers crumpled in her fist. Her anger was still a white-hot coal in her chest, but his words poured over it, not extinguishing it, but transforming it into something more complex and painful. The scale of his deception was monstrous, but the confession that followed was devastating in its honesty. She wanted to scream. She wanted to forgive him. She wanted to walk out and never look back. "I need time," she whispered, her voice hoarse. I can't look at you right now." "Ilara, please, I said I need time," she nearly shouted, hugging herself as if she could physically hold the pieces of her broken trust together. Without another word, she turned and fled the study, leaving Julian alone, surrounded by the ruins of his carefully constructed plane. The truth now lying between them like a shattered vase, its pieces too sharp and too numerous to ever be fully gathered again. The final board meeting was in 12 hours. The air in the penthouse was frigid. A silent war waged across its vast, expensive spaces. Ilara had not spoken to Julian in 2 days. She moved through the rooms like a ghost, tending to Isabel, who was now full of energy and color, her recovery a brutal counterpoint to the emotional collapse happening around her. The money for her treatment had been a miracle, but it now felt tainted. The strings attached tightening around Alara's throat. Julian looked hollow. He'd stopped shaving, and the shadow on his jaw made him look less like a polished CEO and more like a man staring into the abyss. He didn't try to approach her. He simply prepared for his own execution, meticulously organizing the documents that would hand his life's work over to men like Victoria's father. He had given up. He believed he had lost her, and without her, the company, the money, the penthouse, none of it mattered. The morning of the meeting, Alara dressed mechanically in one of the elegant outfits bought for the wife of Julian Thorne. She looked the part, but inside she was fracturing. She walked Isabel to the car that would take her to a follow-up appointment, her sister's happy chatter a distant buzz. "Will you and Julian be here when I get back?" Isabel asked, squeezing her hand. Alara's breath caught. "I don't know, sweetheart." The truth was she didn't. She had spent the night staring at the city lights, the two paths before her agonizingly clear. Path 1, walk into that boardroom, play her part, secure the future Julian's money had promised. She would be upholding her end of the contract, saving him from ruin, and guaranteeing Isabel's security. It was the safe, practical, dutiful choice. The choice of a prisoner grateful for her gilded cage. Path 2, tell the truth. Reveal the farce. It would destroy Julian. He would lose everything. The board, led by the Sterlings, would pick his empire apart. She would be free. Free of the lies. Free of the contract. Free of the man who had looked at her life and seen a business opportunity. But she would also walk away with nothing but the memory of a kiss that had felt like a beginning and the crushing weight of what might have been. The boardroom of Thornman Holdings was a temple of cold power. Mahogany, chrome, and a dozen pairs of unsympathetic eyes. Julian sat at the head of the table, his posture rigid, his face a mask of resigned acceptance. He didn't look at her as she took the seat beside him. The air was thick with the silent gloating of his rivals. Mr. Sterling, Victoria's father, began the proceedings with a smug smile. "Well, Julian, the day of reckoning. We're all eager to meet the woman who finally captured the elusive Mr. Thorne, and to verify the terms of the will have been met." The lawyer produced the document. The succession clause requires verification of a legally binding marriage with a certificate and a testament from the board that the union appears legitimate and is not a temporary arrangement or a sham. Julian slid their marriage certificate across the table. It looked like a death warrant. "And you, my dear?" Sterling turned his predatory gaze on Alara. "Are you prepared to attest to the legitimacy of this union?" All eyes fell on her. Julian finally looked at her, and in his eyes, she didn't see a plea. She saw an apology. He was ready to fall. She stood up. The room fell silent. Her heart was a wild drum against her ribs. "The union," she began, her voice quiet but clear. She looked at Julian, truly looked at him, not at the billionaire, but at the man who restored cars with bleeding knuckles, who covered her with a blanket, who looked at her like she was the most real thing in his fabricated world. She saw the cowardice and the courage warring inside him. She saw the man who had loved her from a distance because he didn't know how to do it any other way. She made her choice. "The union," she repeated, stronger now, "is the most real thing I have ever known." A shockwave went through the room. Julian's head snapped up, his eyes wide with disbelief. "My marriage to Julian began with a contract," she continued, her gaze never leaving his. "It began with fear and desperation on both our parts. But it did not end there. She was weaving truth and lie together, creating a new, more beautiful story. We built something real. We built a family. We built a home. It is not a temporary arrangement. It is my life." She reached out and took Julian's hand. His fingers were ice cold, but they closed around hers like a lifeline. "So yes," she said, turning to face the stunned board. "I attest to it, completely. The silence was absolute." Then slowly the lawyer nodded. The seal was pressed onto the document. It was done. Julian was saved. As the board filed out, their plans foiled. Mr. Sterling shot them a look of pure venom before stalking away. They were alone in the vast room. Julian was still holding her hand, staring at her as if she'd descended from heaven. "Why?" he breathed, the word choked with emotion. "After what I did." "Why would you do that?" "Because I love the real you," she said simply. "And the real you is worth saving." "But the contract is over, Julian. It ends today. The man who negotiated it is gone. The question is, who are you now?" He didn't answer with words. He dropped to his knees right there on the boardroom floor, his arms wrapping around her waist, his face pressed against her. It was a gesture of utter surrender, of gratitude, of love. "I'm yours," he whispered, his voice raw. "If you'll still have me. No more contracts. No more lies. Just me." She sank to her knees with him, cradling his face in her hands, wiping away the tear that escaped his eye. "Just you," she echoed. That's all I ever wanted. Their second kiss, there on the cold, polished floor of the boardroom, was nothing like the first. It was not a question or a shocking breach of contract. It was an answer. It was a promise. It was the foundation of something brand new, built not on a lie, but on a shocking, beautiful, and hard-won truth. The deal was over. Their life was just beginning,